Alan.
So one thing I was going to ask anyone, but Boris in particular, is, I mean, well, one thing I've noticed in looking at these trends at the state level in American politics is, one thing I've noticed in looking at the state trends in party politics is the increasing one-party control of so many states, which goes along with the other trends that we're seeing. And I think we've now got 39 states that are completely controlled by one party, if you include both chambers of the legislature and the governor, which is the highest it's been in, I don't know, many, many years. And fewer that are, fewer with split party control. So one would expect then, I guess the question is, what are the consequences of that, given the kind of polarization that we're seeing in so many of these states in terms of producing states? Because what we seems to me that we're seeing states going in very diverging directions in terms of policy, and you kind of showed that to some extent. But we're seeing it like on Medicaid expansion. Yeah. We're seeing it on gun control. We're seeing it on abortion policy. We're seeing it in a whole bunch of areas that the states seem to be really pulling apart. So we don't have gridlock necessarily, but we have states really pulling apart in opposing directions. That seems to be a pretty significant trend from what I can see. But it's not my area.
Well, I mean, it depends what you think of. If you think polarization is bad, yeah, then California or Colorado should displease you. On the other hand, if you like liberal politics, California and Colorado are great news for you. I guess it depends. As far as Medicaid, you brought up Medicaid expansion. One thing that is interesting is a lot of nuances at the state level that you don't see in Congress. So Medicaid expansion, the Republicans stood as one in opposition to the ACA. Not so true at the state level. Even in conservative states, so you have a state like Arkansas that passed Medicaid expansion. They had to subvert. This is a very conservative state dominated by Republicans that had a supermajoritarian 75% threshold, and yet the Republicans split in the state, along with Democrats, were able to pass Medicaid expansion. And across the states, quite a number of Republicans have actually supported Medicaid expansion, the state exchanges, and so forth. So state Republicans are not clones of congressional Republicans.
But overall, the states controlled by, I found states controlled by Democrats have all expanded Medicaid.
Oh yeah, that's for sure true. I'm saying the case is not hopeless in a Republican-controlled state. Yeah.
If I could just add to that, I think, in your question, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think what the states are experiencing really demonstrates nicely the distinction between polarization and gridlock, right, that they don't necessarily go hand in hand. Right. The states there's not been a ton of gridlock in the states. They've actually moved very sharply in different directions. And to me, that really shows, that the costs and benefits of an individual living in a particular state have changed dramatically. If you're in a same-sex marriage or relationship and you want that recognized, that matters where you live. If you're Latino, that matters where you live. If you want your children to have access to abortion or not, that matters a lot. And so I think if anything, this could actually increase sorting to the extent people can move around.
I wonder if there's been any research done on the relationship between newspaper reporting and the ability to move the states in any direction.
I think the next panel, I don't know if they're going to hit that directly, but they're on media and polarization. Yeah. Be prepared for that question.
In the States, yeah.
Oh, in the States, yeah. I don't think so.
Well, there's, this comes from a paper that Hans Knoll was working on with John Zoller and Marty Cohen a few years ago on, I guess it had to do with the quality of media coverage. And this wasn't necessarily state, but this was more like looking at coverage within a congressional district. And the research was focusing on just the quality of coverage, and that is how much of an overlap there was between a media market and a congressional district. And basically, where the coverage was better, there tended to be more moderation. That is, voters will actually punish ideological extremists, but only if they know they're extreme. And they find that out through the media. So there's, I guess, some evidence there that the media can make a difference.
this is sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I know there are corruption indexes for countries. Are there any for states? Because whenever I look at your graph and I look at the ones that are on the bottom, it's Louisiana, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Arkansas. These are states that we think of as generally corrupt, and so maybe the secret to reducing polarization is to let legislators grease their hands a little more, and sort of repeal the conflict of interest laws. And let this. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but let's look for a relationship.
No, it's not actually. It's not. No, it's not.
What about Illinois?
Illinois is not that polarized
Yeah,
either.
it's kind of true.
Jim Alt has a paper on this. Yeah, and competitive. I think there the focus a little bit more on the competition between the parties, but yeah, you'd expect a more competitive, maybe in a polarized system. The parties are looking at each other far more sharply.
Oh. Mike in the back.
So Boris, it's great that you're bringing up the competitive nature of the party politics within the state. So when you're presenting these charts that are trying to disprove, say, primary type, you're not controlling for that. You're just doing simple bivariate scatter plots. And so I'm wondering, does this hold up when you do multivariate analyses to look at all of the factors that are going into the politics within the state? Because I get a little skeptical when I see bivariate regressions or bivariate correlations to disprove something.
Yeah, there should be. I don't know if it's actually out yet, but this is in an AJPS April issue, so we have the full models there for you to take a look at. Yeah.
So I have a question about the relationship between state and federal polarization. And so, one interpretation would be it's the kind of maybe more of what Seth was talking about, is parties as organizations and networks and so forth. And so then if there's polarization happening at the state legislative level, then that would just infuse everything that's happening, including the congressional. The other version, kind of what I'm hearing from Boris, and it's not the only thing Boris talked about, would be more that, there's characteristics of districts, and then hence you get a certain pattern of polarization based on characteristics of districts. And it seems potentially, at least in some cases, those could be going in different directions. And I'm curious, is it the case then that, say, Colorado, actually as I just say this, it seems like maybe this is the case that their federal elected officials have been polarized as well lately, or not, or if you have thoughts about that.
No, that's a good question. I'm thinking actually now in terms of Sean's work, finding that it was, I guess, the very polarized House that produced the current senators, and in the same way, state legislators act as the field team for those who get into the congressional delegation. So, yeah, I think you see some of that. I also think that there are, I think there are pretty substantial differences in some of the institutional rules, and people will behave one way. Some of the research I did in California, just looking at the way people behaved in the cross-filed state assembly back in early 20th century California, was different from the way they behaved when they eventually got elected to Congress, which was a much more party-oriented system. So I think there's a little bit of both going on. I don't know if I have a great answer for that. But
Yeah, I don't think so either. And I think that in the figures that Boris presented about the way the distribution of ideology inside the district, that's really interesting and compelling. And I think, at these different levels, it's not just different levels of government, it's that they're dealing with different constituencies that are increasing in size. And so it doesn't, I don't think it translates as directly.
I just wanted to add on the issue of state legislatures to Congress. There's been some interesting work done on that recently, looking at selection effects. And basically the pattern is that if let's say you're in a non-polarized state legislature, but you're far right, so you'd be in good fit with Republicans in Congress, you're more likely to run for Congress because you're a better fit with them. On the other hand, let's say you're moderate Republican from some state where the parties aren't that polarized, so you go to Congress, you're going to be in this uncomfortable middle, you're more likely to stay in the state legislature. And so there's a kind of reinforcing selection effect where people move up when they're going to be in a congenial atmosphere by moving up, more congenial and don't move up when that's not the case.
That's interesting.
Is it good?
Danielle Thompson. Is Danielle Thompson?
Yeah.
Would there be any overlap there between ideological orientation and national versus state orientation? Usually imagine a fairly moderate state legislator who just isn't all that interested in broad national issues. They're much more comfortable, working on sewage treatment.
I don't recall.
I could have chosen mental health.
Over here.
Hi, Aaron Sherb with Common Cause. So for states that have plebiscites, referenda, what impact do those have, if any, on a state on polarization?
For plebiscite, for what issues?
Just in general, states that have.
Oh,
do you see
just
any,
direct democracy states?
Yeah. Do you see any difference in polarization with states that have plebiscites versus those that don't?
Well, one thing we do see is that when you have a plebiscite is one way to break a gridlock in a state, and so immigration reform doesn't pass in a state and in California until there's an initiative about it, I guess.
But in your data, I mean, in California, Washington, Colorado, I mean, those are all
Right,
the highly
right,
polarized
that's
states.
true,
It seems
that's
that
true.
those are also the
So-
states that have direct democracy.
There's an awful lot of sort of progressive Western states that were rating high polarization. And
Yeah.
Maybe there's a little bit of connection there with what Mo mentioned, the presence of corruption. Some of these states have reputations for particularly clean, honest government, shaped by the progressive era. And I have no idea why that would make the state more ideological or not, but it sure looks like it.
Well,
It makes it more polarized. I mean, if
Yeah.
just going.
Yeah,
with the
yeah.
raw
I mean,
data.
we're
Yeah.
we're conflating the different terms, ideological and polarization.
one of the things that drew me to some of the case studies I do, which are almost all from former progressive states, Minnesota, Nebraska, California, is that you have this combination of like these sort of leftover progressive era rules that are designed to hamstring parties and really limit their size, limit their activity in elections, and you also have a lot of polarization there. So you have officially weak, but unofficially, in effect, very strong parties, and I was just sort of curious by that.
Yeah, that's something you and I have talked about
Yeah.
for many, many years, that California is the classic example of a state with very weak formal parties, but very strong and very ideological informal parties. I mean, going back to J.P. Monroe's The Political Party Matrix, which was a study of party politics in L.A. County, that California is always the classic example you turn to say, listen, what we usually use to measure party strength doesn't always get at what is really going on. Why California, the state of Hiram Johnson and Earl Warren, becomes a state of Bob Dornan and Barbara Boxer.
Yeah, and I don't know that this is an accident necessarily of history, that that the older style party machines had a pragmatism to them, that these new sort of ideological organizations really don't, but that's confounded by a lot of different things going on at the same time. So.
Great. So this is a question for Boris, and it's partly because of my eyesight from this far away. You have new data, 2013 data. Your data before had been up to 2006, and I know the big story you told us it's a little more polarized, but it's still kind of, it has some significant differences among the states. Are there any other highlights you wanted to share? Sort of what's come out in the new data, either particular states or just trends of types of states that are becoming more polarized.
So I think the story is largely the same. The one big thing that you do see is a movement in a state like Nebraska, which is rather dramatic. Now it's it's like China, to the story of Chinese economic growth, like when you start at a very low base. So Nebraska started at a very low level, and it's polarizing rather dramatically in the face of official nonpartisanship. And just also to me is impressive is just the continuing polarization in California. You'd think they'd hit a ceiling, and you've yet to test the ceiling. Maybe, I'm waiting for the fist fights and the chokings, but there's more happening. And of course, the more fruitful data would be going back in time, but the states make it extremely, unlike congressional efforts, the states have been make it extremely difficult to access historical data, and we basically we have to pay a law firm in Little Rock to go into the state archives and get out these old journals for us, and yeah, it's very painful, slow, and expensive. So that we see in the Congress, the polarization happened starting in the 70s, and we'd love to go back. And it's, in a couple of states we do have that. Unfortunately, not all 50. That's the problem.
Because one of the
Yeah.
is just we've seen in this period, even the last 7 years, a
Yeah.
number of switches of traditional, especially the South, traditional Democratic legislatures to Republicans volunteer, lagging indicators of a long trend. Some of those, I think, I can spy that they do seem to be becoming more polarized. But Louisiana would maybe Georgia. Is that do you see that in the last 7 years, the new data, or is it kind of
In a lot of the southern states, you see Republicans sort of maintaining and Democrats getting more liberal, and part of this is the elimination of the old white conservative Democrats, and that the remaining ones are centered in the cities and in college towns and so forth. And, that's something you do see. The Republicans are not changing very much in those states.
Well, if I may, one thing that strikes me every time I see state level research, and we saw some of it today, is the extent to which I think a lot of what we think matters turns out not to be systematically related once you expand beyond Congress. So you looked at primaries, redistricting, whether it's voter laws, campaign finance, et cetera. So at what point do we need to sort of take a step back and ask ourselves, have we gotten it wrong by being able to look at this data?
Well, I'll say something about that. I think Congress is so important as a political institution. I'm not telling the people in this room that it's important to know what has happened in Congress and what is going on in Congress. And I think better understanding the national story is very important. But for thinking about reforms, I think it's helpful to know are these things actually related out of that context, where you're holding something's constant, got agenda control or party control. And that's where I think some of the states and work that's done at localities or other approaches can help us know not necessarily that it is wrong, but that it may not generalize in the same way in certain contexts, and possibly understand some of why that would be. Like New England, why would inequality not be related to polarization there? And start to develop understandings of in what context these things are true or not true. So, but the data availability and the theory and the findings we already have at the national level are very important for informing that. Mm-hmm. And then I think of it more as a testing ground for understanding the kind of the role of context.
Generally, this is why I'm a big advocate for state-level research. I mean, there's that sort of the phrase that the states are the laboratories of democracy. I mean, partially that's a metaphor for policy generation, but also partially you can use them as a lab. I mean, we have a lot of evidence, and when we try something in Congress and it works or doesn't quite work, we don't really know the cause. We have 50 states out there that are all experimenting with different things, and you can kind of mess with them, and no one will tell anyone, and it's great. But they're all Americans, and they're all sort of roughly within the same parameters of a constitution. But there are subtle differences that can actually be very instructive for how we try and approach this at the federal level.
People want to answer that question.
Doesn't that mean then that you guys of all the panels should be the one to come up with
causal relationships. N equals 49, if not 50, instead of N equals 1 for all these federal people?
Well, we have 2,000 state Senate districts, so that's better still.
There's a lot of correlations today, not a lot of explanatory.
We just have smaller standard errors, that's all.
That's always the rub, isn't it?
It's the rub. I mean, we're looking for solutions. We have to know what really is the problem, what really is the cause.
Well, I think it's, if anything, I think states are probably the place to look. I mean, we have actual institutional variation.
Yeah.
And as Seth mentioned, there's also a lot of institutional commonality. And there's just a lot of the problem is partly one of data is we're kind of stunted a little bit about how much data we have at the state level, whereas we're sort of embarrassed by it in terms of Congress. And so this is a plea for more money. Send that our way.
Yeah, the NSF, all that pushback that stripped money from social sciences, this is maybe a good argument for pushing back. Well, I thought we settled that corruption was the solution. Okay, we have time for one last question in the back.
Hi, Xander Furness from the Sunlight Foundation. So my question is related to Elizabeth bringing up how the relationship between how polarization can mitigate the impacts of party control and sort of the party's ideal point. And so I guess my question is, in these states that we now see so much single party control, to what extent is sort of the radicalizing party over time the one that is the minority party that's maybe adopted this as a strategy to mitigate the policy outcomes of the majority controlled rest of the state?
No, I think that is a very good question and would be even more evident in our data because of these being based on policy stances, so not having any agenda control kind of voting, which has other limitations, but it is a strength of being able to place the parties on where those people, when they ran as candidates, wanted to be, which of course is constrained by the electoral context. I thought about that in response to Alan's question about there could be two types of polarization. There could be polarization where the two parties actually have to bargain with each other to get something done, and there could be a similarly polarized state in which one party is winning and one party is complaining. Maybe you think about the difference of the House and the Senate or something like that, where the same where we would expect different things to happen with those two different kinds of polarization, that it's more of a minority stance.
Right, you see asymmetric polarization of that drift, particularly on the minority party.
Yes, and so I think I just thought about that earlier when the question was asked, and I think I'd like to try to figure out a way to maybe even get some rough approximation of that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.